Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to be discussing the physiology of gas exchange in the respiratory system. Now, if you have not watched the first video on structures of the respiratory system, please go back and watch that now. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we get oxygen into the alveoli. How do we get it through all those tubes and down into the alveoli where gas exchange can happen? And a lot of this has to do with the pleura. So do you remember that the pleura are the serous membranes that surround the lungs? And there are actually two of them. And let's see, I'll draw them. The first one I'm going to draw in red, okay? So this one is going to be the visceral pleura, and the visceral pleura is closest to the lungs. There's another membrane outside of that one, and I'll draw that one in purple, and that one is further away from the lungs. It's closer to the body wall. Okay, and this one's called the parietal pleura. All right, and in between the two of them is Sarris fluid, which is secreted by the membranes and is pretty slippery, and so the two membranes can slip past each other and it reduces the friction. And this space between the two is called the pleural space. Okay, so the Sarris fluid actually has two different functions. One of them is to keep the two membranes from sticking to one another, so it lubricates the two membranes. And there's another function too. So imagine these pleura are like two pieces of saran wrap, very, very thin. And if you were to get them wet and stick them together, they'd be very hard to pull apart. If you pulled on this one in this direction, this one was going to come with it. If you pull on this one in that direction, this one would come with it. So they're not going to be very easy to pull apart. They're stuck together. And we're going to use that characteristic to help us when we try to inflate the lungs. So let's go back to the diaphragm. Do you remember how we talked about how when it's relaxed and the muscle is not contracted, it's going to be domed up? The diaphragm is actually attached to that parietal pleura. So these guys are stuck together. And we also have some other muscles over here. I'm going to draw them in green. That are the muscles that are between the ribs of your rib cage. And those muscles are called the external intercostal muscles. Okay, intercostal is because they're in between the cartilage between your ribs. Okay, so when the diaphragm contracts, it's going to flatten and it's going to pull down on that parietal pleura. And when the external intercostal muscles contract, they're also attached to the parietal pleura. And when they contract, they actually are going to lift up and out. So put your hands on your chest and breathe in. You feel how your rib cage is actually expanding away and up. So when the external intercostal muscles expand away and up, it's pulling on the parietal pleura out. And when the diaphragm expands, it's going to flatten and pull down away from the lungs. And it's going to pull on that parietal pleura as well. So during contraction of those muscles, it's going to cause inspiration because we're pulling the parietal pleura away. And the parietal pleura is stuck to the inside of the body cavity and is being pulled away. And because the visceral pleura is stuck to the parietal pleura, it's also being pulled away. And the visceral pleura, remember, is attached to the lungs. So what we're doing is we're actually enlarging the lungs by doing contraction of the external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. All right, so now we need another piece of paper. So I'm going to redraw the lungs here, so bear with me for a second. Let's make them pink, because healthy lungs are kind of pink. So you have your lung, you have your diaphragm, you have the visceral pleura is attached to the outside of the lung, to the tissue of the lung. So that's the visceral. And you have the parietal pleura outside that. And the parietal pleura is actually attached to the diaphragm on the bottom. And you also have the muscles in between the ribs that are called the external intercostal muscles. Here's the diaphragm. When you go through inspiration, I think I spelled that wrong. When you go through inspiration, you're going to contract these two muscles, 1 and 2. This is actually a set of muscles, but you're going to contract 1 and 2. That's going to cause them to pull on the parietal pleura, which is going to cause them to pull on the visceral pleura, which is actually going to cause them to pull on the lungs. So the lungs are going to get wider and taller. And so the volume in the lungs is going to increase. Now, one of the things that happens is when volume increases in a space, pressure decreases. Out in the environment, out in the world, at normal sea level, the pressure is about 760 millimeters mercury, and that's 1 atmosphere. When we decrease the pressure in the lungs, we're actually going to decrease the pressure to about 756 millimeters of mercury inside the lungs. So we've created a pressure gradient. And you remember we've talked about concentration gradients before. If you have a lot of stuff over here and very little stuff over here, things will generally go down the concentration gradient. It works the same way with pressure. If you have more pressure, higher pressure outside and lower pressure inside, air will enter the lungs. That's inspiration. So we're making the air come into the lungs by changing the volume and the pressure. Now, during expiration, it's a little bit different process. Instead of having to contract something, we just release. So we relax the external intercostal muscles and we relax the diaphragm. And as they move, the diaphragm will move back up and the external intercostal muscles will move back in. What's going to happen to the volume of the lungs? The volume is going to decrease, right? Feel again, when you breathe in, you can feel your lungs getting bigger, your chest cavity getting bigger. When you exhale, the chest cavity gets smaller. It pushes down on the lungs and it makes the volume smaller. The volume's getting smaller, the pressure is actually going to increase. And in fact, what happens when we exhale is we make our pressure about 762 millimeters of mercury. So it's not a huge difference, but it's enough that the air will go through that series of tubes down its concentration gradient. And that's called expiration. The take-home point here is that inspiration is an active process. It's active because you have to do contraction of these two different sets of muscles. Expiration we call a passive process because all we have to do is stop contracting these guys and it will cause the volume to go down and the pressure to go back up. So drawing air into the lungs during inspiration and exhaling air from the lungs during expiration is basically changing the pressure or changing the volume of the lungs, which then causes changes in the pressure. So what's controlling this whole thing? For that, we're going to go to another video. The next video is called Homeostasis and Regulation of the Respiratory System. See you there.